Hey everybody, Andy from Sound of Muzak. We've got another top 10 video, specifically and finally continuing Journey Through Muzak. Hated that I did that, keeping it in. If you've been following this channel, I've been doing a series called Journey Through Muzak, where I do a top 10 for each year, starting with 1965, and so far we've done that year, along with 1966, 1967, and here we are, 1968. Been well over a year since the last video. I feel like these are always my intros to the videos in this series. One might say it really has been a while. But we're plowing through this series. This is a series that I wanted to do way back. I'm still passionate about it. It's what I want to continue, with knowing that there may not be a timeline for the next video in this series. So we're just going to plow on through when we can do these, hoping to do them a little more consistently, but again, we're not adding a label. What are you going to do? So, let's just get into it, guys. 1968. We came from the year before, 1967, Summer of Love, Psychedelia, you name it. 1968 comes, and darkness. That's what we've got. Darkness. This is really that period where Vietnam War has hit an all-time peak. Summer of Love has ended. Now it's just protests, almost proto-punk music, if you will. And the 60s are just crumbling, man. And the music very much reflects that. Courtesy of Rock Music Timeline, to give an overview for this year, the rock musical Hair opens on Broadway. 500,000 people march on Washington, D.C. to protest the Vietnam War, with musical acts such as Arlo Guthrie, Pete Seeger, John Denver, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. In addition to that, you've got the Beatles, Donovan, Mike Love from the Beach Boys, and actress Mia Farrow, and others traveling to India with the Maharishi. This would go on to have a tremendous influence on the Beach Boys and Beatles music specifically. Gibson introduces the Flying V guitar, one of my favorite looking guitars, and the final episode of the Monkees TV show airs on NBC in the US. Elvis Presley, this is also the year for him with his comeback special on NBC. And this is also right around the time period where I reference both proto-punk, but also hard rock music is starting to gain and ground into what we know as heavy metal a year or so later. For our number one best-selling song of the year, we have Hey Jude by the Beatles, and the best-selling album worldwide is the White Album, aka the self-titled Beatles album. We're on that record in a bit. So, of course, before we get into the top 10, we always have to do an honorable mention. This, of course, could be really just my 11 through 15. But I'm also going to leave a link of my Rate Your Music list for my favorite records of 1968. As that list, I think we're at 53 records specifically. So you can see everything from 16 on up as well. But for honorable mentions, we're going to start with the underrated Beach Boys record, Friends. Very, very transcendental sounding record, as I referenced prior, very much influenced by the Maharishi. Then at number 14, we have Lady Soul by Aretha Franklin, killer record, all-time classics on this album. Then 13, tragically at number 13, I have to put Electric Ladyland by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. It's my favorite Hendrix album, hands down. It's an amazing record. Just missed the list, partially due to the length of that record. Then at number 12, we have Miles in the Sky by Miles Davis. And then number 11, a record that I'm really surprised made it as high as it did. I've been re-exploring the latter half of this man's category. I talk about him all the time on this channel. That's, of course, by John Coltrane, one of his first posthumous releases, if my timeline is correct there. Great free jazz record, killer musicians and session players on that album. All right, so let's get into our top 10. Before we start at number 10, I just want to say that overall, when I look at every year that we've done a top 10 for so far, while I believe 1967 might have had more 10 out of 10s for me, I would say thus far, 1968 is my favorite year that we've covered so far. And we're kind of getting into that period in popular music where pretty much from 1968 to, I don't know, we'll say 1980. I could retract that later, of course. But roughly 1968 to 1980, this is just like the golden era for music, right? All sorts of genres. And to me, this is really where it starts. By the way, I did forget to mention, microphone's not working. We're doing AirPods. Hopefully sound quality is okay. Enough's enough. All right. Number 10, we have the self-titled Silver Apples record. Silver Apples. This guy right here. This is, of course, a reissue. So Silver Apples put out 2 records. This one and one after that called Contact. This band consists of only 2 members. A guy named Simeon Oliver Cox, who plays the synthesizer and is the vocalist. And then drummer Danny Taylor, who also does backing vocals as well. This record literally just consists of drums, vocals, synthesizers, as I just stated, specifically the oscillator. This is right around the time period where you're seeing this first wave of rock bands really incorporating and experimenting with electronic music, with bands specifically such as the United States of America and Electric Storm, to just name a few. And the Silver Apples were very much part of this first wave of, like I said, this electronic rock late 60s era. What I really like about this record is it has this weird dichotomy of being ahead of its time, but also of its time as well, which is an oxymoron. But let me explain. For starters, singer Simeon Oliver Cox, we'll just refer to him as Oliver from here on out. No one sings like him today. But there's also this really fascinating combination of electronic noise that almost gives it this proto-dance type of feel. And that can largely be a testament to the rhythm section with, again, just being drums. Our opening track, Oscillations, is almost this like proto-German krautrock thing that would just be only a few years ahead the time of this record, despite the fact that this is a very American record. The drums have this almost resemble electronic drums, but let's be clear, this is an acoustic drum set that's being used on this record. The oscillators are just in your face on this song, but nobody was using this in pop music. This even predates some of the zany stuff that Brian Eno would do in the early 70s. Track 2, Sea Green Serenade, is another song that I love. It just has this fantastic psychedelic melody that puts you in this euphoria, if you will. I also love the drums again. I'm shouting out enough. Danny Taylor again is that drummer. Kind of gives it like this jazz vibe. But I also love the vocals on Oliver's part. Kind of reminds me of Tom York's more robotic vocals that he would use on a song like Kid A. Track 3, Love Fingers, another amazing track. I believe there is what sounds like a theremin on this song. I could be mistaken. But I hear bands such as Germany's Neu! And of course Kraftwerk as well too had to have been influenced by this track and this band. But my favorite track off this record is going to be track 5's Velvet Cave. It's just a great side 1 closer. And I love that bass. One of the very few songs that have bass on this record. This song kind of sounds like Pink Floyd Piper at the Gates of Dawn meets the Velvet Underground is the best way I could describe this. Side 2 is pretty good as well too. I love track 8's Dancing Gods, but it doesn't have anywhere near the same effect as side 1 of this record does. This record, bottom line, is just known for its pulsing rhythms and electronica that just predates everything from Can to the aforementioned Neu! And Kraftwerk, Suicide, Stereolab, Portishead, you name it. All those bands were influenced by this record. I love it. This is going to be, for me, a 9 out of 10, and it is my number 10, Silver Apples. Okay, so at number 9, we have another debut self-titled record. This is going to be Os Mutanas by the Brazilian band Os Mutanas. Os Mutanas is a Brazilian rock band that sort of linked the Tropicana movement in the late 60s with psychedelic rock music, along with acts such as Gilberto Gil, Caetano Veloso, which I butchered that pronunciation, and Jorge Ben, all of which feature on this record between vocals and songwriting credits as well. As I mentioned, this was a musical movement that was dictated during the 60s when Brazil was sort of going through its own dictatorship and transitioning from that. This record bridges Brazilian sensibilities, but with studio trickery very common in the 60s, along with feedback, distortion, and music concrete as well. I stumbled upon this record a few years ago, and I gotta say, it's a pretty critically acclaimed record overall, with it being number 12 on Mojo's 50 Most Out There Albums of All Time, number 9 on Rolling Stone magazine's 100 Greatest Brazilian Albums of All Time, number 39 again on Rolling Stone's Top 40 Stoner Albums of All Time, and rightfully so for all of those aforementioned lists. For the sake of not embarrassing my white self, I will refrain from pronouncing any track names when we're talking about this record. But track 2 has this really cool fusion of garage rock, again meets some of those Brazilian pop tendencies, and it's just a really cool juxtaposition. I love the mix of traditional electric instruments, along with the sounds of an auto harp with various percussion throughout. Track 3 is probably going to be my favorite song off this record. It's just beautiful and weird. I love the dreamy vocals throughout this track, especially during the 2.5-minute mark, where there's just this fuzzy electric guitar that kicks in. It's so cool. Track 5 is a song called Baby, and I swear the singer on this track sounds like Mark Bolan from T-Rex. It's not Mark Bolan, by the way, but sounds just like him. And then jumping ahead all the way to track 11, it has this cool psychedelic jazz swing. It's another example of some of the cool production techniques that they were using throughout this record, as well as their sophomore release as well. This album does also include a cover of the Mamas and the Papas song, Once Was a Time I Thought, which is translated to Tempo No Tempo. Brilliant cover. I would even say probably better than the original, although the original is a great song too. This is just a really great record if you're looking for something different but also semi-familiar. Check it out. It's going to be Os Butanas, and I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10, and it is my number 9 in my top 10. All right, so at number 8, we have, just realizing, 3 in a row, another self-titled debut record. I mentioned this band before when we were talking about the Silver Apples. It's going to be the United States of America by the United States of America. So like the Silver Apples, this band was sort of in that era of electric rock bands, if you will, or rather rock bands experimenting with electronic music. Anyways, this record, the best way I could describe it is as a band taking the sound of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour era with methods of John Cage and Stockhausen as well. So more of that music concrete's kind of creeping into this record, like the Silver Apples album, which makes sense as band leader Joseph Byrd was a classical musician who actually trained under John Cage. You also have the lead vocalist Dorothy Moskowitz, who just sounds like an even more tensed up version of Grace Slick from the Jefferson Airplane. Track 1 opens up with a song called The American Metaphysical Circus, and as the name would suggest, it literally sounds like a circus. I do wonder if this is a nod to the Beatles with their song The Magical Mystery Tour. But like that song, it has this cosmic, hazy sound. Again, I love the usage of the marching band nod and how that just has this really cool psychedelic effect throughout. It almost kind of reminds me of the Flaming Lips record Transmissions from the Satellite Heart. Track 4 is another song I really like, The Garden of the Earthly Delights. And this song just rules, man. It really does. I love the drums being the center point to this song with just these added sound effects throughout. Again, studio trickery at its best. And it's just clear that they were really taking advantage of stereo sound, as this would have been right around the time where we have started to have seen the transition from mono to stereo. Track 7 is another song I like, Coming Down. It's literally what I would imagine what it feels to come down from an acid trip. Is just the best way I could describe the sound of this song. I love how it transitions also to the next track, Song for the Dead She, which is also a beautiful track. But I would say my favorite track off this record would be the closer, The American Way of Love. This song I'm a big Animal Collective fan, very much laid the blueprint for that band sonically. This track, along with the rest of this record, is just a product of its time. But this product sounds so fucking cool. It's broken into 3 parts: Metaphor for an Older Man, California Good Time Music, and Love Is All. And Love Is All just has this climactic ending that just captures the whole record sonically. It's such a cool record. I could see this not being for everyone, but again, just like with our number 10 and 9, if you're just into something different, but still with those pop sensibilities, check this record out. The United States of America's self-titled debut album is a 9 out of 10 for me. All right, at number 7, we have The Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society by The Kinks. This is their 6th studio record. And this is where we sort of start to transition to the Kinks doing whatever they want era. I think we talked about in one of our last videos how the Kinks, they were banned from touring in America around this time. While they missed out on things such as the Monterey Pop Festival along with Woodstock a year later, I think this did allow them the freedom to just kind of do whatever they want. And they had some mild success doing this as a result. This would also be right around the time where Ray Davies would start to loosely base his songwriting on character studies with themes of nostalgia, memory, and with this record, preservation. Preserving the old ways, if you will. Like the previous record, Something Else, which was also my top 10 for 1967, there are a wide variety of influences, ranging from music hall to folk, blues, psychedelia, and calypso even as well. Track 1, which is the title track, The Village Green Preservation Society, kicks the theme off this record. But it's track 2, Do You Remember, that I find really interesting. The line, people often change, but memories remain of people can remain. Again, capturing, preserving the good things, the fine things in life. Walter is the story of 2 old friends separated by time and distance who no longer have anything in common despite their shared history. Jumping back to track 1, because I realized we kind of combined track 1 and 2 here, the Village Green Preservation Society. I love the quick tempo and the excellent use of mellotron, along with track 2 as well. And the mellotron really is just the key instrument throughout this whole record. Then jumping to track 3, Picture Book. This song's just so damn catchy, and we get a lot of catchy pop songs throughout this one. Another character study, though. Picture Book describes an aging narrator's experience flipping through a photo album reflecting on happy memories from a long time ago. What I really like about this song is how it employs 2 acoustic guitars overdubbed with Dave Davies' electric guitar. Again, just really neat usage of the studio, especially at the time. I also like how Peter Quailoff's bass playing throughout the song almost doubles Ray's rhythmic guitar playing. And that's just what gives it that distinctive hook to the song, quite frankly. It's a very interesting but complex mix, which I really like. And just a lot is happening in this, again, 3-minute pop song. Very much a wall of sound, if you will. Then we're going to jump ahead to track 6, Big Sky, another favorite, and the centerpiece of this album as well. I love Ray's lead vocal, how it alternates between singing and then speaking, but still harmonizing with Dave. And his wife, Rasa Davies, who was known to do backing vocals a lot, contributes a wordless falsetto harmony. Just beautiful. This track, to me, is up there with songs like Waterloo Sunset and Days, which was tragically left off this record, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Track 8, Animal Farm, is the side 2 opener, and I just adore this song. It's very much my runner-up track off this record. It just puts a smile on my face every time I listen to it. I love the opening line, "This world is big and wild and half insane." Very much applies today. While the title of this track does share the title of the George Orwell classic, this track doesn't relate to that dystopia world whatsoever. Rather, it's more on anti-urban themes. The narrator in this song is so frustrated with modern society that he's willing to go live among the animals in order to get away from a world so big and wild and half insane. My biggest issue with this record is it's just banger after banger, with even side 2 opening up with a few bangers. But then by like the 3rd or 4th track off the second side, it just becomes very mid and really does fall apart. There's a song called Phenomenal Cat that has these weird chipmunk voices that I just can't stand. Same with a song called All My Friends Were There, which is a song that has grown on me. The way Ray exaggerates his vocals in this song are just nails on a chalkboard. And while the closing track, People Take Pictures of Each Other, is a pretty good song, I just feel like it's a lackluster way to end this record that, again, just had these complex poppy songs with hook after hook after hook. Before we close this review on this record, I do want to talk about the European version, as when this record was first released, specifically in Sweden, Norway, France, and I believe Italy and New Zealand as well, there were 2 other songs included. The aforementioned Days, which is the Kings' A Day in the Life, and then another song called Mr. Songbird, which is a lovely track as well. Those songs were then omitted on what would become the final version of the record, which then included The Last of the Steam Power Trains, Big Sky, and I believe the title track was added at that point, I'm not sure. People are going to debate the definitive versions of this record, and while I will say the final released version I think is the definitive cut, decide that lackluster side 2, it's a bummer that we didn't get the song Days off this record. Days is a song that recalls a past relationship, so again, continuing that theme throughout the record. A past relationship of remembering what could either be a friend or maybe an ex-lover. The song's theme of nostalgia, again, it lyrically fits with the concept of Village Green. Instrumentally, the recording of this song incorporates more overlayers of both acoustic and electric guitar, but also some wonderful harmonium and piano as well. Beautiful track. It is a tragedy that it's left off this record. If Days were on the record, it would be my favorite track, but because it isn't, we have to go with that centerpiece, Big Sky. The Kinks would go on to record a few other killer records as well, but this is really where the classic Kinks begin. So despite that lackluster side 2, I am still giving this album a 9 out of 10. It's a record that I adore and I can just put on any time, especially those 8 or 9 killer tracks. Check this one out. All right, so number 6, we have Miles Davis, Nefertiti. This is Miles Davis's 4th record with his second great quintet. Prior to that, we had ESP, Miles Smiles, and Sorcerer. And this is actually his last fully acoustic record. In my honorable mentions, I talked about the record Miles in the Sky, which was released later in this year. That record could very much be considered a transitional album, as he was starting to experiment with electric instrumentation that would go on to basically be jazz fusion. But back to this record, what's interesting about Nefertiti is that Davis himself did not contribute to any of the compositions of these tracks. Saxophonist Wayne Shorter, whose record Speak No Evil was my number 5 for 1966, wrote 3 of the pieces on here, with also pianist Herbie Hancock writing 2, and drummer Tony Williams writing 1 of the pieces. But with that said, don't let that make you think that Miles didn't contribute to anything, because Miles' contribution throughout this record are just, again, just amongst some of his greatest work, at least in my opinion. Opening up with the title track, this song is just so gorgeous. I love the dual subtle nature between Miles' trumpet and Hancock's piano. The song is interesting in that it has a horn section that repeats the melody numerous of times without individual solos, while the rhythm section improvises underneath, sort of reversing the traditional role of a rhythm section, especially with this more modal sound of jazz. And speaking of the rhythm section, I love how Tony Williams is just pounding away towards the climax of this piece. And then Miles just comes in at the end, just reeling everybody back. Again, not undermining Miles' contributions here. Track 2, Fall, is the second Wayne Shorter track. And it's songs like this that, to me at least, show that the chemistry and playing that Miles and Wayne Shorter had could really rival the chemistry that Miles and John Coltrane had a decade or so earlier. Another beautiful, luscious track. The melody is just very calming throughout. Wayne Shorter has this stunning saxophone solo that will just rip your heart into shreds. But then on top of that, you have Herbie Hancock's very sparse chords and occasional piano fills underneath Shorter's solo. And even Ron Carter gets a bass solo, a little bit of bass thrown into this track, which is very rare, especially on these type of jazz records. Then we go into track 3, Hand Jive, and I would describe this as the Tony Williams show. And this is his sole composition off this record. This really is his time to shine as a drummer. And Tony Williams is someone that's just become one of my favorite jazz drummers in general, and this track very much represents why he's such an underrated jazz drummer. This track we're also kind of starting to see a little bit of some foreshadowing with jazz fusion, again in the rhythm section. Ron Carter just slaps on bass throughout this track, and then Wayne Shorter towards the end just comes in with this fierce solo. Killer. Then we go to track 4, which is called Madness, side 2 opener. And this is the Herbie Hancock composition. And this time we have, despite the fact being a Hancock composition, Wayne Shorter and Ron Carter are very much front and center with their playing. But then halfway through it becomes the Miles show with just an incredible solo from him. One of the very last classic Miles trumpet solo that we will hear pretty much during this incarnation of the Second Great Quintet. But this song is a song that could fall apart, but it doesn't. And that's due to Herbie Hancock's piano textures that just kind of hold everything in place. It's not just about blowing someone's head off with musical pyrotechnics. There's got to be some sort of emotion in there. And despite all the music pyrotechnic madness that goes on, again, it's Herbie Hancock's subtle playing on this track that just reels it all in. So good. The rest of this track is great too. This is just overall, I would say, an underrated Miles Davis record. I don't know if just where it falls in the Miles canon timeline. This one gets overlooked, but check it out, especially if you're a fan of the Second Great Quartet. This record for me is going to be a 9 out of 10, and it is my number 6. All right, so we are in the top 5, and what a top 5. I'll just say that these are all 10 out of 10 records for me from here on out. All of these records mean so much to me and would all easily be in an all-time favorite albums list, if that's even something that I'm capable of doing. So with that, let's talk about number 5. And number 5 is going to be White Light, White Heat by the Velvet Underground, their sophomore release. It's crazy when you look at the VU history through a modern lens, and when the Velvet Underground and Nico came out, that record did not do well. So what do? They put this record out. And also, it didn't do well at the time. But the importance of White Light, White Heat, along with the Nico record, cannot be stated enough. This record continues the lyrical transgressive themes that were on the first album. Lou Reed that is, continues to be inspired by the lyrical likes of William S. Burroughs, along with Alice Bailey, but musically is drawing from free jazz musicians such as Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry, who would go on to play on a Lou Reed solo album 10 years later, The Bells. An underrated Reed record, by the way. This record is it's nihilistic without any limits. It's experimental without any compromise, and it's harsh and abrasive. Punk starts here. I keep pointing at Aretha. Punk starts here. The title track, track 1, White Light, White Heat, details the physical effects of amphetamine. Don't do drugs. It's a rock and roll rave up would be the best way I could describe this song. It consists of a very simple 2-chord progression with killer organ from John Cale, along with a killer guitar solo from Lou Reed at the end. This is my kind of rock and roll. I just love this song. And David Bowie would go on to cover it throughout his career. Jumping ahead to track 4, Here She Comes Now, was actually a song written for Nico initially, but she had been kicked out of the band before they went on to record White Light, White Heat. A song like this is very much needed on this record, especially coming off of the first 3 tracks, which I didn't even mention track 2. But the song could have also fit very comfortably on the 3rd Velvet record as well. There's this really subtle guitar solo at the end that very much prepares you for what's to come, both on a couple tracks on side 2 of this record, but again, the 3rd VU record as well. Great song. Love Reed's vocals on this track as well. And then we jump to track 5, I Heard Her Call My Name. This is a love song for a dead girl with guitar playing very inspired by Jimi Hendrix, believe it or not. This is just classic garage rock, but with a guitar solo that very much emulates Ornette Coleman. Again, this is such a punky sounding song, very punk guitar solo, and this is 10 years before punk rock. You can't not talk about White Light, White Heat without mentioning the closing track, and bar none my favorite song off this record, and that's the complete mammoth Sister Ray. Sister Ray is just 17 minutes of noise rock wankery that I can get down to. I know that can sound very off-putting. There's no bass in this song. The drums are extremely compressed. The guitars are turned up all the way, very distorted. And the organ of all things, again, John Cale's organ playing, fully distorted, fully turned up. On paper, this song should be a disaster, but it's a noisy masterpiece. I'll take this over 90% of prog rock songs. That's how much I love this song. Very, once again, inspired by free jazz, but being emulated in a rock band. Lyrically, this song is a semi-abstract story with plenty of references to drug slang, to sexual slang that you can look up on your own, but unlike anything else you would hear. Like, this even makes any of the hippie sounding lyrics from some of the biggest bands of this time period look wimpy in comparison. If you choose to embrace a song like this, it earns the 17 minutes. If any band can squeeze beauty from a monster, it's the Velvet Underground. Beneath the noise, the guitar freakouts, the overdriven bass, whether it's compressed or not, the primal sounding drums, you name it, but you will find simple yet lovely melodies underneath it all. This is the Velvet Underground at their peak level experimentation as the 3rd record, which is my favorite Velvet Underground record, by the way, takes a completely different shift in sound and more so focuses on songwriting and melody. But this record would go on to influence so much of the early 70s. Glam rock would go on to influence punk, proto-punk, post-punk, noise rock, industrial, you name it. This record, it just blows my mind that this came out in 1968. Again, I mentioned Sister Ray, bar none, being my favorite track off this record. The whole record's great. It's a ride. Give it a chance. It's not one that will click right away, but again, the reward is worth it. I know I mentioned this already, but this is a 10 out of 10 record for me, and it is my number 5. Number 4, we have Astral Weeks by Van Morrison. What a record this is. This is one of those records, kind of like the year before the Love record that was in my top 10. This record took me a long time to really get into and appreciate. This is a record that's very rich and deep, with lyrics that are just melded so beautifully with these free-flowing melodies. It very much can be described as a musical trip. We have side 1 of this record called In the Beginning, side 2 called Afterwards. And this record stylistically mixes styles such as R&B, jazz, soul, Celtic folk, blues, but it's all organic. It doesn't feel forced at any point. Track 1 opens up with the title track, Astral Weeks. I love the beautiful acoustic guitar flourishes throughout this song. The song already basically sets the tone that this is music for the heart and not for the brain. And that's what I love about this record, is this is a record that I could just very much put on and just listen to the music. Lyrically, as I mentioned, it's phenomenal, but for me, this is a record where the music is really what I'm in for this record for. Then we go to track 3, probably the best well-known song off the album, Sweet Thing. I had this song played at my wedding. This is just a song that my wife and I both love whenever it comes on. And it puts you in this heavenly aura feeling, so it felt very fitting to play this song on what was a very special day for the both of us. And overall, this record, by the way, just has a perfect side 1. But jumping ahead a little bit to track 4, Cypress Hill. This is one of those songs that takes nearly 5.5 minutes for it to build, but the build-up is just worth it. Van Morrison's voice just becomes more urgent and desperate as the song is building, but you hear this haunting piano that's also building as well in conjunction to Van's voice. Then the tension breaks, and Van spits out the line, "Nobody, no, 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 nobody stops me from loving you, baby." This is teenage heartbreak just at its worst. Track 6, Madam George, begins with what can best be described as a sad, reflective guitar tone, but lyrically, it very much picks up the themes of side 2 of this record, which again is named afterwards. And it does appear that years have gone by and the narrator in the song is describing how visiting back his hometown has trudged up these memories of youthful love. About 5 minutes in, Van begins recounting his having to leave her being the girl of the song for the last time. And for the next 4 minutes, Van does some of the most captivating singing that I've ever heard from anybody. This is also accompanied primarily by a very delicate string arrangement with just some phenomenal gut-wrenching upright bass. This is a record when I was listening to it over and over and jotting down my notes. I had a hard time breaking this one down than I typically do with the albums that I talk about. Because to me, Astral Weeks is just one of those very few records which just feels so effortlessly beautiful and genius at the same time that you just need to listen to it. And I alluded to this at the top of this review. There's no deep meaning necessarily, other than the themes of side 1 and side 2, but there is complex detail and layers both emotionally and instrumentally going on here. Again, this is a heart record and not so much a brain record. The best way I could really close this review for this record is by Lester Bangs, which if you've not read Lester Bangs' review of Astral Weeks, that is like legend in of itself, his review of this record. And he says, Van Morrison is interested, obsessed with how much musical or verbal information he can compress into a small space, and almost conversely, how far he can spread one note, word, sound, or picture to capture one moment, be it as a caress or a twitch. He repeats certain phrases to extremes that from nobody else would seem ridiculous because he's waiting for a vision to unfold, trying as unobtrusively as possible to nudge it along. Sometimes he gives it to you through silence by choking off the song in mid-flight. It's too late to stop now. That captures this record as a whole. I don't know what else I could add to that. I don't know if I mentioned, but my favorite track is the title track, Astral Weeks, and this is another 10 out of 10. This record is a masterpiece. Give it its due and give it time. Getting into the top 3 here. Number 3, we have one of my favorite albums of all time, the notorious Bird Brothers, By the Birds. What a record. This record just culminates everything that they essentially did on the first, counting this record, 5 Birds albums. The Birds are, I believe when I was preparing this list, the only band since starting this series, besides the Beatles, that have had a record in my top 10. 1965, I had their sophomore album, Turn, Turn, Turn. 1966, I had 5D or Fifth Dimension. In 1967, I had Younger Than Yesterday. And here we are with the notorious Byrd Brothers. The Byrds released another fantastic album later this year called The Notorious Byrd Brothers. That would be my number 19, I believe, give or take. And that's a totally different record in of itself. There it goes. Going back to the Notorious Byrd Brothers, though, this is just a record that keeps me guessing every time I go back and listen to it. And it's a record I listen pretty often. I would say I have this album on my turntable, maybe even still to this day, once a month from when I first got into it a few years back. On paper, this record should not work. It should not have worked. And it's very baffling. The reason for that is you had David Crosby that was kicked out during the sessions. Supposedly this, the horse here is supposed to represent Crosby. And then drummer Michael Clark left midway through the sessions. Gene Clark, who's on the first two Byrds records, comes back for like a few days, and then he leaves again. So yeah, this record just shouldn't work. I mean, they just had everything going against them. It was primarily done by Chris Hillman and, of course, Roger McGuinn. It also baffles me how overlooked this album is as well, too. I love the psychedelic production done by Gary Usher on this record, who worked with Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. And this record is just pinnacle Byrds, continuing the experimentation from the previous two records, blending folk, rock, country, which they would further explore on the next record, Baroque pop, and a lot of elements of jazz as well. Track 1, Artificial Energy, is just a spaced out Sgt. Pepper, is the best way I could describe it. What's interesting is this song is about amphetamine, and they're very open about that, whereas 2 years later they had 8 Miles High and swore that that song was not what it was about, yet we're very open with Artificial Energy. The best way I could describe Artificial Energy, other than the Sgt. Pepper comparison, is it's a spaced out doo-wop track almost. Track 2, going back, classic Goffin and King song, of course. The Byrds do a great rendition of that song. I love Roger McGuinn's blissful 12-string Rickenbacker throughout the song, but there's also this very atmospheric pedal steel guitar playing that's going on, and it just creates this very hazy vibe. Apparently going back is part of the reason why Crosby got kicked out of the band, as he felt that they shouldn't be doing any more covers, and it just didn't belong. And I'm going to say, sorry, Cros, but you're wrong. Then moving on to track 3, 4, and 5, I believe you could clump these 3 songs together. Natural Harmony, Draft Morning, and Wasn't Born to Follow, which is another Goffin and King song. Natural Harmony very much conveys a sense of longing for innocence and youth. I love the very laid-back, jazzy feel with dreamy-like vocals throughout. And I just love how it transitions into Draft Morning, which is very much a song that holds relevance today. Draft Morning continues the very jazz, laid-back feel, but then before you know it, we have this exploding machine gun effect replicating the intensity of the Vietnam War. I would say thematically, both Draft Morning and then the track that comes after, Wasn't Born to Follow, addresses being a soldier drafted in the Vietnam War, witnessing the horrors, the day in the life of being a soldier, while I Wasn't Born to Follow very much kind of caps off the trilogy of songs with escape and wanting independence. Just an incredible side one. And then we go to side 2, and tracks 9 and 10 I would sort of clump together as well. David Crosby's Tribal Gathering and Dolphin Smile. Tribal Gathering has this really cool, almost like David Brubeck feel with the instrumental bridge. And then it comes in with this wailing, fuzzed out guitar. I don't know who's playing guitar here. I want to say it's David Crosby, as it sounds like his style with the very jazzy, unique chord progressions there. And if it is Crosby, then he went out on a bang as far as leaving this band goes. And then it transitions to Dolphin Smile, another Crosby track, very much continuing the jazzy vibes again. That can kind of be described as like early yacht rock. Not my thing, but it works here. And there's also very cool tribal drumming throughout as well. This song is about the need to escape. Again, continuing that theme of escapism, using just nautical imagery. The style is very much in the vein of CSN and CSNY songwriting, with tracks such as Wooden Ships and The Lee Shore that come to mind. Despite this record being criminally underrated, it seems that over the years it has gained a reputation, and many citing it their best record, myself included. This record manages to capture the band at their height of creative powers while crumbling and falling apart at the same time. They continue to push themselves lyrically, musically, sonically, and this kind of just caps off, like I said, the first 5 Birds records. My favorite tracks are the aforementioned Tribal Gathering and Dolphin Smile, and this is a 10 out of 10 for me. Check this record out. It's a half hour on the dot. Despite the experimentation, it's a very easy pop record to listen to. All right, at number two we have The Odyssey, not Aretha, The Odyssey and the Oracle by the Zombies. This is their second studio album. Interesting backstory on this record. So it was released in 1968, of course. The Zombies were just dropped from Decca Records. They ended up financing the sessions of this record themselves. They signed on to CBS, released 2 singles. Album comes out, does okay, band breaks up. But then a year later, Time of the Season becomes this mega hit, thanks to Al Cooper, who was a staff producer for CBS at the time. And again, the band broke up at this point. Time of the Season was so huge that several fake versions of the Zombies were put together by promoters. The Odyssey and the Oracle, to me, is the closest that any band, any record got to sounding like Pet Sounds. Like Pet Sounds, these are just 12 beautiful, well-written, pop psychedelic songs with influences of classical. Sonically and lyrically, it's very moving, heartwarming, you name it. Kicking into track 1, Care of Cell 44. This is a very positive and romantic song, despite the fact that it's about a lover's partner being in prison. This tells the story of a man's girlfriend coming home from a stint in jail. Whether this is a protest, if you will, who knows? Or perhaps it could be a mental institution. The way the melodies flow hauntingly on the words, "You are far away," kind of hints at something a little darker than prison, hence the mental institution reference. There's this sense of pop-twinged darkness that continues throughout this side of the record. By the way, this is another record that's a perfect side one, in my opinion. This album is easily one of the best documents of the psychedelic era. Track 4, Beechwood Park, one of my favorite songs off the record, has this hazy, complex melody throughout. The lead guitar is played through a Leslie cabinet. Apparently the mellotron on this is John Lennon's. And there are just luscious vocal harmonies throughout. This sound is wistful yet grounded, sentimental but childlike. Almost like a song like Penny Lane by the Beatles, or again, the aforementioned Pet Sounds. There's just not enough I could say about this song. I do love the line in the chorus, "Oh, roads in my mind, take me back in my mind." Just so good. Then jumping to track 9, This Will Be Our Year. This is probably my favorite song off the record. It's a very personal and sentimental favorite, and another song that was played at mine and my wife's wedding, and I even incorporated some of the lyrics to the song in my wedding vows as well. And I just think this is an overlooked gem on the record as a whole. It's a great love song, very mushy, yet convincing. And I won't forget the way you helped me up when I was down, and I won't forget the way you said, darling, I love you. You gave me strength to go on. Just utter joyfulness. Rod Urgen's sprightly piano very much serves as the driving musical force throughout this track. This Will Be Our Year very much leans heavily on the strength of its refrain. It's one thing to say, this will be our year. It's the second part of the line that gives the first so much weight. Took a long time to come. Can't not talk about this record without referencing the closing track. I referenced it before. Time of the Season. This is the band's swan song that in a way feels so out of place from the rest of this record, yet I can't picture this record without it being on here. This song places its emphasis on groove and musicianship rather than the lush arrangements that we were hearing throughout that define the other tracks. This is as masterful as pop gets. It's simple but great songwriting. Well arranged in terms of originality and accessibility, but above all else, being an artifact that represents the period of time in which it was born, while also being a timeless song. The Odyssey and Oracle is a perfect blend of everything that was just so right about the 60s, packed with some of the best melodies you're ever going to hear. This is proof that the 60s, in my opinion, were the golden age for pop music. As I've said before, pop music can resonate with everyone while still leaving room for experimenting and being musically interesting. Something that would very much no longer be the case as we get to the 70s. But above all that, there's also a coldness to the album's sound, but it's genuine. It's cold, but there's human warmth to the messages, despite how dark it can be at times. Again, This Will Be Our Year is my favorite track. This is such an easy album to get into. It is a 10 out of 10, and it is my number 2 for 1968. We're at number 1. You know me. Talked about him. I've talked about this record. We finally have a Beatles album at number 1. Beatles White Album. I just talked about this record recently on our Talking Muzak podcast, which you should totally check out, by the way. This is my second favorite album of all time. So it's my number 1 for this year, and it's my number 2 of all time. This record just captures everything that I like about music, and it just has a little bit of everything. What's interesting about this record is this is the first record to be released after Brian Epstein's passing. I believe technically Magical Mystery Tour was released after his passing, but a lot of those songs were written during the Sgt. Pepper sessions. So this is the first one, and this is really the first time we're starting to really hear this band fall apart, yet somehow it all comes together. And I don't know if that's due to the format of this record. I don't know. But regardless, this is one of those records where over the years I used to do the same thing that everybody else would do on the internet, try to put together the perfect sequencing to this album just on one disc. And, I gotta tell you, I'm at a point where it's all needed. I want to hear all of it. I think it's all needed. There's something about this record where you'll have several killer tracks, classic Beatles tracks in a row. Like I'm thinking, for instance, between the end of the A side and the B side, you have back-to-back My Guitar Gently Weeps, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, Martha My Dear, I'm So Tired, Blackbird. You've got those 5 songs in a row. Those 5 songs would be any band's best songs ever. But then you go into a track after that like Piggies and Rocky Raccoon, where it's like, okay, now we need to dial back a little bit. I guess the point that I'm making here is some of the throwaways, if you will, some of the less directionless tracks, I've come to love every bit as much as the classics. And this record has a lot of classics. The aforementioned Blackbird, Helter Skelter, Back in the USSR. This album's just all over the place. And that's what I love about it. It's one of those records, depending on my mood, it'll just depend on what my favorites are. I'll go through phases where I really hone in on the Lennon tracks, which this record as a whole has my favorite John Lennon songs, specifically tracks such as Year Blues, Julia, Dear Prudence, Glass Onion, Sexy Sadie. I can go on. But then you have some of the more stripped back McCartney pieces, such as, again, Rocky Raccoon, Blackbird, Mother Nature's Son, songs which very much would show us where he would go with records like McCartney 1 and even the Ram album as well. But then you also have George Harrison's contributions. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, probably his greatest song up to this point. He would have a few more on Abbey Road, of course. Best contribution that Eric Clapton made, in my opinion, ever. Bold statement, I know. But even some of the more subtle tracks like Long, 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 one of my favorite George Harrison penned Beatles tunes of all time. But then there's also, again, some of the throwaways, such as a song like Birthday, which has kind of become my go-to happy birthday song when I wish people or text people happy birthday. I just send them that track instead of just saying happy birthday. But then even a song like Revolution 9 would be a song that I would always reference when I used to do spelling tests with my students. Whenever I would get to number 9, I would go number 9, number 9, number 9, and then say the word. And it was just always something that would make me crack up. And it was funny because one day I remember I didn't do it, and my students called me out on it. They're like, wait, Mr. King, what about number 9, number 9? And I thought, you guys just didn't think this was funny, but this whole entire time, I guess they did a little bit, I don't know. Or they just enjoyed my dorky sense of humor. But anyways, this record I didn't really come up with any notes for because I wanted to do my best to speak from the heart. And while I'm not sure if I've articulated myself as far as how much this record means to me, I can't emphasize it enough. It's a record that my wife and I have listened to probably more than any other album, maybe besides Abbey Road and Pet Sounds. It's always been a go-to car album for longer car trips. So many car rides, just kicking out the jams to this record. Again, there's just something for everyone in this album. And that's what draws me to it more than anything else. It, by all means, it's not a perfect record, but for me, it's perfect for its imperfections. And it's also really what became the gold standard for what a double record could be. And that, to me, is the joy of this album, along with other double records that come to mind, is it gives you this space to just do whatever you want, whether the execution is or isn't always there. That's the charm to the White Album for me. It's my favorite Beatles record, like I said, and it's my second favorite album of all time. So that's my top 10. We finally got 1968 out of the way. Leave a like. Comment your top 10 below. Check out our podcast, Talkin' Muzak. Check out some of our other videos. I recently did my top 20 favorite records for 2023. Not part of the Journey Through Muzak series. And then Rob just did a cool top 10 of his favorite Led Zeppelin songs. So we're continuing to put content out. We're also on all streaming, Spotify, Apple Podcast, you name it, we're there. We don't post all of our videos there for audio, but this one will be up there for sure, as well as my other Journey Through Muzak lists as well. Can't say when 1969 will be out, hopefully sooner rather than later, but as I said at the beginning of this video, we're not putting a timeline. It'll just come out when it comes out. But I hope you enjoyed this list. Like I said, leave a comment, and until next time, guys. Peace.